All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to STL History Live, Mississippi Meanderings, where the Peep Light leads. My name is Aaron Pelker. I'm a community engagement coordinator with the Missouri Historical Society, and I want to thank you for spending part of your Thursday night with us. Tonight's program is the second part of a three-part Mississippi Meandering series in collaboration with the Mississippi River Water Trails Association. This program is presented in conjunction with the museum's current exhibit, The Mighty Mississippi, which is open now through June 6th. I want to thank both Bank of America and the JSM Charitable Trusts who sponsor the Mighty Mississippi exhibit and the educational programming presented with it, respectively. I also want to thank both the Zoo Museum Tax District and our museum members. Without your generous support, we wouldn't be able to host programs like tonight's. Next, I do want to mention that both the Missouri History Museum in Forest Park and the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum downtown are open to the public. Your safety is a top priority, and we would love for you to visit us if you feel comfortable doing so. Advanced free reservations are required and are available at mohistory.org. Lastly, before we get to tonight's presentation, I want to mention a couple of the features on Zoom you may find helpful. Closed captioning is available. To turn it on, click the closed captioning button on your Zoom toolbar. You can also submit questions for our speaker at any time through the Q&A dialog box on your Zoom toolbar. We'll do our best, but we may not have time at the end to answer every question. Tonight's program will also be recorded and available on the Missouri Historical Society's YouTube channel early next week. Last, your feedback is always important to us, and we'd really appreciate it if you could complete a short survey that will automatically open in your internet browser. So please look out for that. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Joan Twillman of the Mississippi River Water Trails Association. Thanks for your partnership and for being here tonight. Enjoy the program, everyone.
Hi, I'm Joan Twillman from the Mississippi River Water Trail Association, and it is a magnificent trail. It reaches from Saverton, Missouri, which is near Hannibal, to St. Louis, and is 121 marvelous miles of bluffs, hills, lowlands, river. We are a bunch of volunteers. It's an all-volunteer organization. And we try to take care of the river. Our goal is to connect as many people as possible to the river and to the surrounding land in order that people would really, really enjoy their experience with the river so that they'll keep coming back and so that they'll take care of the river. We have an online presence in Facebook, Instagram, and we have a beautiful website. It's at MississippiRiverWaterTrail.org. And our website features maps that include places to access the river, places to rest and picnic, and a whole lot of other amenities along the way. On our website, you will find our calendar, and it mentions some of our events. We're in the process of adding things to it, but I'd like to mention one, which is Paddle Fest, which is Get Everybody Out Onto the Water Day, and that's on June 12th. We would like to encourage you to become a member of our organization. Memberships include access to special paddling events, discounted paddling clinics, our newsletter, and a River Water Trail sticker. And anyone who signs up as a member between now and the end of this month will also be entered into a drawing for a paddle for four, a guided paddle on the Mississippi, gift certificates from the Alpine Shop. Thank you very much, Alpine Shop. And we also have a copy of one of our board members' books. He's written a number of books on the Mississippi River that are spectacular. And this one is Road Tripping the Great River Road. Signed copy. The cost of our membership is only $15, and we'd like to have you join us. Thank you very much. And I'd like to turn this over to Dean Klinkenberg.
Thanks, Joan. Hi, everybody. I'm Dean Klinkenberg. I'm also on the board of the Mississippi River Water Trail Association. I'd like to echo her thanks to the Alpine Shop for sponsorship, and as well to the Missouri History Museum for partnering with us on these presentations. Normally, the Water Trail Association hosts this event that we call Mississippi Meanderings in January. It's a way for us to get people dreaming about warmer weather and thinking about getting back out on the river. So we're really grateful that this year, given the circumstances, the Missouri History Museum was willing to partner with us to do this event online and to bring these engaging speakers to you and to a wider audience that we otherwise would reach. Tonight's the second of 3 events that we are hosting. Next week, we're going to hear from Dr. David Evans, who's a retired professor of music from the University of Memphis, and he's going to be talking about songs inspired by the Great Flood of 1927. And how those songs kind of offer a perspective on, or give voice to folks we don't often hear from major events like that. Tonight, though, I'm really excited to introduce to you a man I'm going to call a well-seasoned river rat. Lee Hendricks was born near the right descending bank of the Mississippi River in North St. Louis, and he spent his life pursuing the river's elegance and majesty. In the nautical version of Lowell George's lyrics, he's driven every kind of rig that's ever been made, beginning in 1972 when he first set foot on a towboat. The chief engineer informed him that if he ever wore out a pair of boots on the river, he'd be there for life. The engineer was right. Lee now resides in Lake City, Minnesota, coincidentally on the right descending bank of the Mississippi, but 600 miles further up, and he still trips on towboats. He's the author of a forthcoming anthology called Where the Peep Light Leads, in which he describes many of his experiences working on the river. Lee, take it over. It's all yours.
Thank you. What an honor. Missouri Historical Society. Wow. For a kid from North St. Louis who threw rocks into the Mississippi at Hall Street. And this ain't like telling stories around a campfire or at the Buccaneer Club, for sure. So let's hope that I don't mess it up too bad. I want to talk about the title of the presentation and the title of the book. It's called Where the Peep Light Leads. For those of you who don't know what a peep light is, when you're piloting a tow, you're on a towboat, and 1,000 feet or more out in front of you is the tow. And it helps you to be able to tell which way that rascal is swinging. So we take a pole out there. We used to cut them down from willows and other trees and things. And now we have aluminum and alloy metal, but we take that pole and we stick it out there at the head of the tow. And that way you can look and tell which way the tow is swinging. Now, we put a flag out there too to let you know which way the wind's blowing, but at night, you can't see that jackstaff. So we stick a light up at the top of it. We usually use a blue light, although some people prefer another color, I guess, but that's what we call the peep light. And we try to follow the peep light. As long as the peep light's out in front of you, things aren't too bad. If the peep light's ever over to your starboard or port, something's kind of amiss. But I've been following that peep light for almost a half century now. And like I said, I was very honored when Dean asked me to do this program. Now, the challenge is to condense 50 years into 30 minutes. I'm going to give it my best. It's not my favorite subject to talk about myself, but I do like to talk about the river. As Mark Twain said, the Mississippi River is in every way extraordinary. And it's been extraordinary to me for almost a half century. there wasn't anything real remarkable about my youth that I can remember, except on Sacramento Avenue, where I was born, burning leaves in the gutter with Papa and listening to Nana's stories. Nana was an invalid, but she had some awesome Civil War stories that she would tell me, and I would go into her room and sit on her bed, and she would tell me these stories, and I was just fascinated. And there's two things that I have loved in my life besides my family. It's been the river and people who can tell stories. Now, when I was throwing those rocks in the river, pretending I was Stan Musial or Ken Boyer throwing out Phantom Runners, I was overwhelmed by the river. It was everything that I wasn't. It was beautiful, it was powerful, it was majestic, and it was free. And the freedom part is what I really envied. And I wanted to get out on that river. I wanted to be borne away and experience adventure. And when I was 20, I went to a party and met a guy who I'd gone to high school with, and he had worked 30 days on a riverboat and saved himself up enough money to go to Europe. Well, I wanted to go to Europe too, and that sounded like a real good template to me. I'll get a job on a boat, work for 30 days, save all my money, and then I'll go gallivanting around the world. So I started to look in the phone book and look under river, and then I got to this one subsection that said towing companies. Now that sounded kind of strange. I couldn't imagine a tow truck out on the river. I couldn't even imagine what that would look like. But I put them down, and then I went to barge lines. That sounded a little bit more in line with what I wanted to do. But finally, in October of 1972, Huffman Towing Company from Clayton, Missouri called, and the fella said, "You still want to go out on a towboat?" And I said, "Well, I think I kind of do. Yeah, let's go for it." And he said, "Okay, go to Missouri Portland Cement Dock, and that's where you'll catch the boat." And I thought, well, he's going to give me a week maybe to back out of this and change my mind. But I asked him, "When do you want me?" He said, "Be there at 5:30 tonight." So I had come to Robert Johnson's crossroads in my life, and it was time to either fish or cut bait. So I said, "Well, we'll go ahead and give it a shot." And I told my dad I was going to catch that boat, and I got to give him credit. He tried to talk me out of it. He had been on a small ship in the Pacific in World War II. He said, "You're going to hate it. It's claustrophobic. You're going to get scared. It's going to be horrible." Well, I was halfway determined I was going to do it. So I said, "Now I'm packing up my onion sack and I'm heading to the river." So I packed my duffel bag, put a lot of warm clothes in there because it was in October. And he drove me down to Riverview Boulevard, and he left me on the side of the road. And I walked across this walkway, and there was a couple of fellas sitting at the loading dock. They loaded cement there. And they said, "What you doing here, man?" And I said, "Well, I was supposed to catch the Havana." Could you put the picture of the H.F. Leonard up there, Dean? It wasn't called the H.F. Leonard then. It was called the Havana Zephyr. And I said, it's supposed to be here at 5:30. And they started to chuckle. They said, "Man, that boat ain't going to be here at no 5:30. You might as well sit and get comfortable with us." So I sat there with them, and we smoked some cigarettes and talked about some things. And finally, one of them gets right to the point. He said, "Man, you got a girl?" And I said, "Well, I kind of do, because I kind of did." And he said, "Well, you better forget about that. She ain't going to wait no 30 days for you." And as I look back on the next 11 years of my life, that was probably one of the more prophetic statements that's ever been made. But at the time, it didn't really matter. I wanted to get on that boat, and I wanted to go out and experience some out of the ordinary types of things. So, but the boat still hadn't showed up. And it got to be 7 o'clock, and it was dark. And my dad came back in his old 57 Chevy, and he said, "Here, let me drive you around." So we drove around the block a little, listened to the World Series. I remember the Cincinnati Reds were playing the Oakland A's, and he was still steady trying to talk me out of it. I said, no, I'm going to do it. I was halfway determined that I was going to do this. And so we go back, and I went back and talked to those other fellows for a while. And we did about 2 or 3 cycles of this. And finally, it's getting to be after 10 o'clock at night. And I said, well, I wonder if these boys down there in Clayton are pulling my leg. I wonder if this boat's even going to show up tonight. And I made up my mind that I was going to go down there one more time. If that boat didn't show up, I was going to get back in my dad's car, go back to U City, and I don't know, go back to being an usher at Busch Stadium or something. I don't know. So we're sitting there, and I'm talking to him again. And from down the river, we see a searchlight come up, and he slaps me on the leg and says, "There's your boat, man." And so I went back to my dad's car, and I shook hands with him. I told him, "Be careful going home now." And I said, "I'll see you in 30 days. And I stuck a Lucky Strike in my mouth and went down and climbed down that ladder into the mystery below. And I was met by another fellow about my age. I was 22 at the time. And he looks me up and down, and he says, "I never seen you around home before. What part of Breckinridge County you from?" And I said, "Well, where's that?" And he spits on the deck and says, "Damn. Every other deckhand on that boat was from a county in eastern Kentucky, real close to Louisville, called Breckinridge County. And one of the captains would go down to this beer joint called Dead Horse Holler. And that's where he hired most of the deck crew from. Now, if you had some hogs to sell him, you'd get bumped up in line and you'd get your job a little bit quicker. Well, I didn't have any hogs, and I was told to get on this boat. So whether they liked it or not, here I was. And he leads me into that door that you can see down toward the bottom of that boat. There's not too many boats that look like that. That's a few of a kind. And leads us into a lounge, and the lounge is all smoky because everybody was smoking cigarettes back in those days, and had some old torn up furniture, looked like came from a secondhand store on Cherokee Street. And he takes me through there, and he says, "Now you're lucky because you get to sleep your first 6 hours. You're just getting off watch." And that sounded like a pretty good deal. Maybe go to sleep. So we go back to one of the deckhands' rooms, and he doesn't even announce his presence. He just throws the door open and turns the light on. And the guy who is sleeping in the upper bunk, who's going to be my roommate, he jumps out of bed like the Commonwealth of Kentucky State Patrol is in hot pursuit, jumps onto the floor and cuts his foot and starts to bleed. And he's bleeding and cussing with a reckless abandon. And I'm standing there thinking, I wonder if Dad's gone back home yet. Maybe I can still get a ride back with him. But it's too late. The boat had left. So Bobby kept bleeding and cussing. And that went on for about 10 or 15 minutes. And finally, we get the bleeding to stop. And we bring a mop in and mop the blood off the floor. And he goes on to his watch. And I got the room all to myself. And I try to sleep. Well, sleep wasn't going to come this night. Not after all that. And add to that the fact that it felt like they rammed into everything they came to on the river. It felt like they were going to knock me out of bed at any time. And that whole bulkhead of that boat was going to come caving in and drown me in my room my first night. So I thought to myself, what have you gotten yourself into, lad? I tried to sleep, but it just wouldn't come. And then at 5:30, another fella comes in and he switches my light on. He says, time to get up, time to go on watch. You get to go in the galley and eat breakfast first. So I go back to the galley, and there's an older lady there, and I figure she's the cook, and I figure I better get on her good side. So she says, how you want your eggs? And I figure scrambled won't put her out too bad. So that's what I asked for. And she whips me up a couple scrambled eggs and puts a couple biscuits on the plate. And I take my plate over to the galley table, and there's about 6 or 7 chairs there. And these guys are all sitting around looking at me because they all knew each other, but they didn't know me. And I could tell something was amiss, but I wasn't going to step right into it yet. So there was only one chair left. That was at the head of the table. And the grins were getting bigger. when I sat down there, and I'd sat down and ate about half my eggs, and all of a sudden I feel a not too gentle tap on my shoulder, and I look around and I see an older guy there. He said, "Get the hell out of my chair, boy." And that's when they all broke up. It was the best thing that had happened to that crew probably for the whole week. Told stories for a month about that, I'm sure. Well, I jumped out of the pilot's chair. That was the pilot and the captain's chair. And I finished my eggs someplace else and went on about doing a few other things. And after about an hour, the cook calls me over. She said, "Hey, boy," she made an egg sandwich and an apple. And she said, "Take this up to the captain." So I run up to the pilot house with the eggs, and I found my way up there. And I looked out, and it had finally gotten daylight. And we were in a town. It was kind of a dirty old town. And they had told me we were going up the Illinois River. I didn't know what towns were up the Illinois River, but I thought, my God, in the 5 or 6 hours, the way they banged around, we surely got up to Springfield or Decatur or someplace. And I asked the captain, I said, "What town is this, Captain?" And an awkward silence sort of followed. And he looks me up and down and says, "You from St. Louis, ain't you, boy?" "Yes, sir." "You don't know your hometown when you look at it?" And I thought to myself, my God, what an antiquated form of transportation. About knocked me out of bed for 6 hours and we hadn't even got out of town yet. Well, I didn't say that to him because I figured the fewer questions I asked from the rest of that day, the better off I was going to be. So I take my leave and I go back down to the galley, and that's when I met that chief engineer. And he says, "You know, boy," he said, "you come out here in the wintertime, you're going to make it. Because anybody who's stupid enough to make it in the winter's going to be able to tough it out from here on." And that's when he told me about if I wear my first pair of boots out on the deck, I'm going to have it in my blood for life. It just started to sound real nice and lyrical. And I thought, at any moment, this man's going to start singing Old Man River. But he didn't. And that's when I met the mate. And that's when the lyricism stopped. And that's when I realized I was stupid and I was dumb. And those were just the predicates. The real words were coming after that. Well, the mate thought everybody was a stupid MF or a dumb SOB. I wasn't the only one. That analysis applied to just about everybody on that boat. I was going to find out in the next week or so. He even called the captain that when the captain wouldn't put a barge in tow quick enough. So I didn't take it all that personal. And I tried to learn a few things along the way, how to lasso a timberhead with a line and how to mop a deck and how to tighten some wires. And me and the boys from Eastern Kentucky, we started to find some things we had in common. The big thing we had in common is we were all a lot happier when the mate was in bed. So I started to make friends with them. And I was learning a few things. And about 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the galley and they had a little whistle there. And when that pilot would blow that whistle, that was your summons to go up to the pilot house and see what he wanted. So he blew that whistle and I climbed up to the pilot house and come in and said, what's going on, Captain?" Well, very nonchalantly, he says, "Boy, take your spike pole and fish that dead man out of the river." Stunned disbelief. "You hear me, boy?" "Well, shouldn't we call the police?" "Boy," he said, "get that friggin'," and he didn't say friggin', he get that friggin' mate out of bed and grab that spike pole and fish that dead man out of the river. Well, a dead man is something you tie barges off with. It's not a floating homicide victim. Imagine that. Well, I had a lot of imagine that moments and still have a lot of imagine that moments in my career on the river. And I was lucky. I came along at a time that was what you'd call the halcyon days of towboating in the 1970s. And even a stupid boy like me from St. Louis could work his way up. And I went from stupid deckhand and not so stupid deckhand to lead man to mate. And I just have a a lot of thanks to the people who made that happen, Huffman Towing Company being one of them that stuck with me that long. If you could put that picture of what looks like Brett Hull up there, Dean, that's, I was lucky to meet this fella, not the guy in the Blues jersey. That's my son and my wife. But his name was Adrian Hargrove. He's deceased now. But Adrian took a liking to me. And that's what you needed back in those days, was you needed somebody who could mentor you. It was kind of like in the days of Mark Twain, who got Horace Bixby to mentor him. Adrian was one of my mentors. There were others like Buddy Compton, Jimmy Bryson, Leroy Drury, but Adrian was the main one. He saw something in me. I don't know exactly what it was, but he decided that I could become a pilot someday. And this is not on a towboat. That's on the Mississippi Queen, which I'll get to that part of the story later. So Adrian took me under his wing and he taught me everything. Well, not everything, because the man knew so much, he could never teach me everything. But he taught me so much about trying to keep my cool. He said, son, whatever you do, keep your cool. And he not only told you it, he showed you how to do it. I've never seen anyone who waltzed with the river in his arms the way Adrian did. He was a pilot that everybody really honored. And the second thing Adrian told me, which was even more important and even went beyond towboating, was to treat everybody you come to with dignity and respect. And that's one of the things that I've always tried to do in my life. Now, during this period of time, this 11 and a half years that I worked for Huffman Towing Company, I also became very involved with doing outdoor adventure. Towboat wasn't enough outdoor adventure for me, and it was a lot, but I wanted to do other things. And I had a fellow who lived around the block named Bill Rathbun, and he and I would go on a lot of canoe trips together. And then my mom's boss, Carl Bianco, he was going on these really long trips up in the Canadian wilderness. And Bill and I started to go with him. And then another friend of mine, Stuart Hoffman, went on some of those trips. And one year I actually paddled all the way to Hudson's Bay. That's a long way up there. Now, we didn't start in St. Louis. We actually started in Canada. But that was far enough out of the way where if we'd have gotten hurt, we could have died. Nobody would have known it. And I would have gotten buried in an ice cave with a polar bear, I reckon. But we made it back alive, and it was a good adventure. And I just found that I really had fun even doing those kinds of things, even when I was on my days off. And I even got two of my best friends from high school, probably my two best friends, Mike Rothschild and Bill Rathbun, jobs as deckhands with Huffman. Well, 1983 rolls around, and that prophetic statement that man said about me at that loading dock had pretty much come to pass. Relationships just kind of dropped like leaves off the trees for me. And that had its good points and its bad points. The good part of that was I was not encumbered by a family, and I didn't need much. I had an old beater car, and I didn't have a house, but I still had made it to Europe. And I said, that's what I set out to do 11 years ago. So it was hard to leave Huffman. It was hard to leave Adrian. Oh, let me show a couple of pictures here. Can you put that picture of the Ruth D. Jones up there, Dean? Yeah, both. Let's show this one first. That is, or that one, that's me at Lock 19 at Keokuk. And that's what a 15 barge tow looks like in front of you. And then if you could show that other one, that's a side picture of the Ruth D. Jones. That was the last boat I worked for Huffman. And it was hard to leave that boat. We had a really great crew and a really good bunch of guys, but it was time to go. And you can take that down if you want to, Dean. We'll go on to the next phase of life here. So this comes a little bit later. I went to Europe, and I had some friends who gave me some contacts there, and I met a fellow by the name of Richard Gordon, and he ran an outdoor education program modeled after Outward Bound for U.S. servicemen's kids in Berchtesgaden in West Germany. And I got a job as like a gopher, but I really enjoyed it because we were doing a lot of rock climbing and canoeing and route finding. And I said to myself, when I go back to the United States, maybe I can combine these two loves, that I can go out on the river and take folks with me for some outdoor kinds of activities. And I got back to the United States in 1985, and I opened up a Waterways Journal, and there in front of me was the caption, Mississippi River Youth Expedition. And that sounded like something I just really needed to be part of. And it had a contact name there, and the man's name was Hank Schaefermeyer. And I called Hank and told him who I was. And he said, well, you're a towboat pilot who was trained like an Outward Bound? He thought that I was of dubious authenticity, I think, until I went down there and met him. He and another fellow by the name of Vic Nelson. And he found out that I was for real. And he said, son, I think we can use you. He didn't exactly say those words. But next thing I know, I'm going up to Hannibal with my canoe, and we're lashing canoes together and doing all kinds of fun things, taking people down the river, down to Pere Marquette Park. And then lo and behold, a couple of months later, he offers me a full-time job. And it was all the fun things that I had wanted to do. Now, it wasn't quite the Mississippi River like I had envisioned, but it was okay. And the fun part was good, but it was a good mission too, because what we were doing, we were taking diverse populations from St. Louis public schools and putting them together and problem solving and having a group function together. So it was a really worthy cause. And I met a lot of really good people, but the one guy who I guess I connected with more than any of them was that guy sitting there in the bare feet on the front of that picture. His name was Tom Ball, and he loved small boats on big rivers as much as I did. And at the time, the Corps of Engineers, my first experience with the Corps of Engineers was this Adopt a Shoreline program. So we got a group of people together. Byron Clemens was there, Kathy and Jay Lewis, and Susan Hellman. So we went down and we cleaned up a section of the river, and we got the sign up there for the St. Louis Experiential Education Council. And Tom and I discovered we loved doing this so much, we wanted to take other people, teachers, friends, river vagabonds. We'd take them on trips, and we started bringing them up here. And I had known this section river before when in my first phase of towboating, and everybody came up here to the Driftless area and just fell in love with it. They couldn't believe it was actually the Mississippi River. And the river was starting to really come back into my soul again. As much as I loved working for Hank, I needed to get back on the river. I had a wife and a son then, so I didn't really want to do the 30 days on, 30 days off again, but I wanted to get back on the river. So I went down to Gateway Riverboat Cruises in St. Louis and met Tom Dunn and Gary Frommel. And they said, well, I think we got a place for you, the Bella St. Louis. So that looked all right. They were going to turn it into a gambling boat, and I was just going to spend my days cruising and out on the river for a few miles and going home. And I knew that sounded too good to be true. So they moved that boat down to Mississippi, and they said, well, we got another boat that you can go, another gambling boat. And they sent me to Davenport, Iowa to work on the President. Now, if you've been in St. Louis for a long time, you probably remember the president and the admiral. They were run by Streckfus steamers at one time. And they put me up in a hotel called the Black Hawk Hotel, and I would just walk down every day to go on the cruise on the President. The President was just a fantastic boat. I don't know when it was built. I think back in the 1930s, it was originally a steamboat. And we would go on the cruise, and I would go back to the Black Hawk. But again, a very special person came into my life, and he was a crew member. And I remember going back to my Nana's stories. I'm a sucker for good storytellers. And this man's name was Izzy. And he worked back in the engine room. He was the only guy on that boat who had his own room on the boat. The rest of us were at different places through town. And he would come up to the Black Hawk every Friday night and sit at the bar for several hours. And I joined him. And this man would start to tell me these stories about the president in New Orleans and St. Louis. And then the glitter came into his eye when he started talking about steam. And he told me how beautiful it was to be on a steamboat. And I said to myself, right then and there, you're going to do that someday, son. It's going to take a while, but you're going to do it. Well, it didn't take that long, really. I wasn't that enamored with gambling boats, to be truthful with you. And Captain Adrian Hargrove came back into the scene again. You don't need to show his picture again. I think people remember him. And he was working for the Delta Queen Steamboat Company. If you could put a picture of the American Queen up, Dean. So they had a new boat coming out, the American Queen. That's there at Prairie du Chien, not too far from here. And he said, son, I think they can really use you, but you got to go to the Coast Guard and draw the river. So when you piloted that boat, you had to go and actually draw all the places on the river. Take a blank piece of paper and draw from memory the buoys and the bridges and the lights and all that. That boat was over 400 feet long, 96 feet wide. Maybe I'm saying the wrong thing, 92 feet wide. And those stacks there at the time, when I first went on it, were over 100 feet high. But boy, it was a sweet ride. I really loved working on there. And again, met a lot of really, really great people. The thing that I really liked about it was not only being on a steamboat, but being able to go into towns, because on a towboat, nowadays you can't go in at all. It was very rare we could at least go into town back when I first started, but now you can't go at all. But on the American Queen, you could go into towns, and I had a bicycle on there, and I would either bicycle or walk around. I'd go to these places, New Orleans, to the French Quarter, uptown to Tulane, out St. Charles Avenue, Natchez, Mississippi, Vicksburg, Memphis, St. Louis, of course, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. Went to all these places, and I'd have hours to walk around, and I would look at houses and look at people, and I would think of this, what about the stories that are in these towns too? And my imagination would be running away with me. But it was good fun. And if you could show that picture of those two guys on the bridge wing, Dean. So another one of the key people coming into my life, that's me on the right with the walkie-talkies. And that's Captain John Duggar on the left. Now, people who are influential in your life, a lot of times you'll remember the very first thing that they ever said to you. And one of the first things that Captain Duggar ever asked me was, Captain Lee, you ever done any farming, particularly cotton farming? And I said, Captain Duggar, I hate to admit, but if there's one thing in the world I know absolutely nothing about, it's agriculture. And he shook my hand and he said, you should be proud of yourself. He said, because farming is hard work. And cotton farming is the worst kind of farming that there is. And his family owned a cotton farm, and he had to go out and chop and pick cotton. And he said when he got offered a job on a boat, he didn't care what it was that he had to do on that boat. It had to be better than working on a cotton farm. So he started with the Corps of Engineers and worked his way up to become the master of the motor vessel Mississippi. If you want to show the Mississippi there, Dean, that would be good. Now, just to give you an idea of the size of the motor vessel Mississippi, that white towboat behind it, that's at St. Paul. That white towboat behind it is about the size of the Ruth D. Jones. So you have an idea of how big the Mississippi is. John was telling me all these stories about working for the Corps of Engineers, all these people that he knew that had these phenomenal names: Egghead, Neckbone Jackson, Oxtail Eddie, Crying Shame, True Love. And if there was ever anybody who had perfect delivery for storytelling, it was Captain Duggar. And he just kept me infatuated with all these stories that he told. And I said, one of these days, son, you're going to do that. And that came a little sooner than I thought too, because I actually thought that I would be on the American Queen for the rest of my career. I liked it so much, but they had the unfortunate habit of going out of business like 2 or 3 times. Now, before I get indicted for slander, that's not the present owners. The present owners are still quite in business. They're just taking a hiatus because of the pandemic. If you've got a cruise book with them, you're going to go sometime. But at that time, they kept going out of business, and I was getting tired of it. And my wife was getting real tired of it. She said, you need to find a job with somebody who doesn't go out of business. Well, I figured, the United States government doesn't go out of business. They can print money when things get bad. So one of the pilots I had worked with on the Queens was a man named Pete Charmatero. He lived in Memphis. And he became, after Captain Duggar left, he became, along the line of succession, he became the captain on the Mississippi. And he said, I need a couple of pilots. And so I put in for it. And luckily I got it. And, right now we should talk about floods a little bit. Floods are important in a riverman's life. My first year, I started in 1972, but in 1973, we had what everybody at that point in time thought might be the record breaker of all time, floods in St. Louis. But then that was eclipsed in 1993 when I was on the president in Davenport. Well, I started on the Mississippi in 2009, and in 2011, we had the biggest one of all time on the lower Mississippi. Now, the gentleman next week is going to tell you about the 1927 flood. And if anybody ever gets a chance to read the book by John Barry about the rising tide, it's a very good read. But that 27 was the most devastating flood on the Mississippi. But 2011 was actually higher and would have been even higher had it not been for some actions that the Corps of Engineers took. Now, we had several missions on that boat. Now, that mission, you see us there with those 2 landing barges at St. Paul. We were doing Mississippi River Commission cruises, and that was like a passenger function. We had the commissioners from the Mississippi River Commission in Vicksburg on the boat to go up and down the river and do town hall meetings with stakeholders. And we would host those meetings in the hearing room up on the on the second deck. And then we also revetted the riverbank. That was our job for the bigger part of the year. We would take revetment barges up and down the river for the sinking unit to revet the riverbanks on the lower Mississippi River. But there was another mission that we had that we didn't think we were ever going to have to do. And that's where the 2011 flood comes in. We would practice what we would do if it came to the point in time where we had to blow up levees. That's right, we had to blow levees up, not build them, because it was a strategic thing to destroy certain levees, kind of like a triple bypass, if you would. Knock those levees out and relieve the pressure on the mainline levees and on some of the towns. And in 2011, we actually had to do that. And I was on the Mississippi, and another fella who was an important person in my life is a guy named Kerry Lewis. And he and I had parallel paths. We both started with smaller barge towboat companies. He started in Cape Girardeau with Missouri Barge Line, and I started in St. Louis with Huffman. But we took similar paths, and we wound up being together on the Mississippi and on the motor vessel Mississippi. And he actually was on one of the smaller boats that went back into the woods there at Bird Point and put the explosives into the levee in preparation for demolishing it. Again, it was something we thought we'd never have to do, but that's what Mother Nature held in store for us. And so floods have been important in my life. 2011, like I say, being the biggest one of all time on the lower Mississippi River. And then in 2013, something happened that I wasn't expecting, only this wasn't good. I was diagnosed with advanced stage lymphoma. And I went back home and was told that if I didn't start treatment, I'd probably not be around in a few months. So I started treatment, and I'm still here. But that was a wake-up call for me, because what that taught me was I should live every day of my life like it's the very last one that I ever will live. And secondly, that God put me on this earth like he put all of us for some reason. And I would try to find that reason every day of my life of why I've been put on this earth. Because he had a mission in mind for me, just like the Corps of Engineers had a mission in mind for me. Well, I went into remission and came back, and about 3 months later, Cap Pete quit. That was a surprise. And the captain's job was open. And I didn't want to do it. But Kerry talked to me, and a few of the other crew members on there talked to me, and they said, Lee, I think you could do this job. I think you should put in for it. And there were some other things that I don't want to go into that caused me to do it. In 2014, I took the captain's job on the Mississippi, and really enjoyed it. That was a different vessel. It was a different kind of towboat than anybody could ever imagine. I loved the crew. I loved the boat. I loved being in Memphis. I was in Memphis a lot and got to have a lot of really good friends down there. Got to know that town really well. But I was away from my wife a lot, and away from my family, and it was like I was a stranger when I came home. It was just taking up too much of my time. So in 2018, I about decided I was going to retire, and but I wanted to do one more thing with the Corps of Engineers. I wanted to go from that boat, that 240-foot long towboat, to one of the small. I don't have a picture of it, but they run a dredge up here called the Dredge Getz, and they needed a dredge tender to work this 40-foot long boat And I said, I want to go back to the dawn of my creation on towboat, and I want to work on one of those small little boats, and I want to do that really bad. And I called my friend Jake Bernhardt up here, and he thought I'd lost my mind. And I said, I just want to try it, Jake. And they took a chance on me, and I was up here for a couple months, and I was learning. I enjoyed it, but it was a more physical job, and my body was starting to speak to me, and it just told me, well, it's time to retire. So in October, I retired from the Corps. And if you could put that rocket ship up there, Dean. I got a call from a fellow who said, we need river advisors. This was called the Delta Mariner. You can't really tell, but that's a ship. And they're loading NASA rockets on that ship. Or actually, I think they're unloading them there. That's in Cape Canaveral. And we would load the rockets on the ship at Decatur and take it down the Tennessee to the Ohio, then down to the lower Mississippi River. And this other fellow and I would get off down at Baton Rouge, and they'd go on around Florida to Cape Canaveral. I did that for a while. It was all right. It was a good experience. I knew it wasn't going to last very long there for a couple of reasons, but it was okay. And then now I work for a real nice, very well run towing company out of Memphis called Southern Towing Company. I do about 100 days a year for them, which is more than enough for me. And Captain Pete Charmatero is my boss again. By golly, I guess that's about the story of my life, or I'm about to give out. If anybody's got any questions about it, now's the time to ask them, I suppose.
Hey there, Lee. Thanks so much. I do have a couple of questions coming through. First of all, one question is, are there any women riverboat pilots that you know of?
There are. The American Queen has one. Some towboat companies, I don't know any names. It's not a lot of women, but we had a woman, actually, Lisa Streckfuss. She was a pilot with us on for Delta Queen for a while, and she came from the Streckfuss family. I don't think she does it anymore, but no, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of women riverboat pilots right now.
So what do you have to do to actually become a pilot? What's that process like?
Well, you have to start getting some days in on a boat, and you get some time in, and then you can go to the Coast Guard. You have to get a letter from the company that you've worked for, and they tell the Coast Guard how many days you've been on board. And then you go down and you present your documentation, and they look at your documentation. Then you have to take a test. And there's different classes of license. You start off, I don't even know what it is, what the process is for towboats anymore. I'm so far past it. I've got a master of towing vessel, plus I have a first class pilot license. But I think they start off with a steersman license, and then they go to a mate's license, and then a master of towing. And to work on the steamboats back then, you had to have a first class pilot license, which meant you had to draw the sections of river that you ran. They don't do that anymore because there's not too many people left who have those licenses. You still have to have a license from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, but that's about the only place that you have to have that.
So we also have a question about your experience with the blowing the Berthes Point levee. We have. Are you familiar with the book When They Blew the Levee about the town of Pinhook, Missouri?
I am not.
Maybe we'll put that in the chat box so people can look that up. I think that focuses on the people who were in the path of the water when that levee was blown in 2011.
Well, I will say this: it wasn't popular with everybody. As a matter of fact, with some people, it was very unpopular. But it was one of those things that it was laid out in a progression, in a scientific progression. When the river stage reached that height, it was agreed that that's what they would do. I don't want to get too much into it because obviously I had nothing to do with any of those decisions. That was the Mississippi River Commission. That I just drove them up there.
You weren't in charge of making that decision, Lee?
That didn't fall on me. That was General Walsh. He had to do that.
That's not part of your, that's not at your pay grade, I imagine.
Yeah, it was well past my pay grade.
Yeah. So a couple different things. I'm just kind of curious too, if you were going to pick like one or two qualities or skills or abilities that you think are really essential to be a good pilot, what would that be?
Well, having a good memory, although if there's one thing that's happened over the years, that's not quite as important as it used to be, because now we have electronic charts, and the chart actually keeps you up. You don't have to turn the pages of a chart or memorize it. You are actually put onto that chart, and you can see yourself. Not only can you see yourself, you see where you're going, where you've been, and who's coming. So a lot of that artwork, the artistic part of it, is not taken care of by a computer for you. But getting enough sleep, that's important. 6 hours on and 6 hours off is what we work, and getting to bed and getting rested up, and coming up to the pilot house in a good frame of mind, and like Adrian said, keeping your cool. That's probably the most important thing.
Well, I know you know this, we're a water trail association and we promote paddling. Mostly people in our group do kayak trips or canoe trips on the Mississippi. And we have to share the river with big boats like the ones that you piloted. Do you have any tips for paddlers on how to coexist peacefully with those bigger boats?
Stay out of their way. I mean, that sounds kind of trite, but they can't stop real quick, and they can't maneuver real quick, and they don't want to hit you. They don't want to run over you at all. But if you get too close, it might be too late for them to do anything about it. When we were doing the Mississippi River Youth Expedition, we had a marine radio, and I was the only one who really knew how to talk to the boats, but that really helped because they knew you were there. And then now it's a bunch of different, it's a complicated thing. If you're on the upper Mississippi, like what y'all were talking about, that river trail from Saverton to St. Louis, I'm sure you spend a great deal of time out of the channel in the backwaters behind the islands, and you're perfectly safe from tow traffic back there. The only thing you got to worry about is Joe Sixpack back there. But if you go down I was thinking about what Maya and Stan had said last week, and it sounded to me like they did their trips in really high water. And that's when you'd really have to watch out, because in really high water, the northbound boats going up the river are going to run out of the channel probably, because that's where they find slack water. And you may think they're supposed to be over someplace in the channel, but they're not going to be. And the other thing, I would never advise doing it at night unless you really knew what you were doing. When Tom and I were doing those trips, we would go out and paddle at night just because I knew the river. But if you don't know where it is that you're going, you don't ever want to mess around out there at night. And for people who paddle, you don't really need to tell them this because they stay pretty sober. But it's the guys on the cruisers and the speedboats, they just get a little too much testosterone, some of them, and want to get a little too close to you.
Right. So I think we're just about done, but I do want to ask one quick follow-up to that, because I'm curious about this. I know some folks, particularly the long distance paddlers, will bring the marine radio along. to communicate with the pilots. And what do you, from the pilot's perspective, what would you like us to tell you if we pick up that marine radio and try to reach you? What do you want to hear? What should we say?
Well, tell them you're a canoe and try to give them your position. I know if you wouldn't have an electronic chart so to tell you where you are, but first of all, you got to identify the tow. And if you're not, well, first of all, your radio that you would have would probably not carry out too far. So you might be able to judge just from, you would filter out just the tows that were in your area, and you would try to ascertain what the name of that towboat was and find out what the name of it is, and then call them and let them know where you are, which way you're heading, and see which way they want. They won't necessarily care too much about which side you pass them on generally, unless it's right in a tight bend. But if you pass port side to port side, that's called one whistle. If you pass starboard to starboard, that's called two whistles. If you go to overtake them and you pass them on your starboard or right side, that's two whistles. If you overtake them on your port side or left side, that's one whistle. Whether you'd overtake a tow in a canoe or not, I don't know. I would say probably that wouldn't happen.
Probably not something we would advise, right?
No, yeah, you wouldn't be going fast enough, probably.
Right.
Unless you caught a really slow tow.
Right.
Some of the ones I've worked on over the years, a canoe might be able to pass this. But
Lee, thank you so much for sharing some experiences from your 50 years on the river. It's much appreciated. And I look forward to reading your book. I'm going to toss it on back to Aaron now.
Okay, well, thank you for having me on.
All right, thanks again to Lee and everyone at the Mississippi Water Trails Association. And a big thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. We have our regularly scheduled STL History Live programs on Tuesdays at 11 and Thursdays at 6:30 p.m., as well as Soldiers Memorial Chow and Chats on select Wednesdays at noon. You can see a couple of the upcoming programs of this slide, and you can find links for all our upcoming programs at mohistory.org or on the Missouri History Museum Facebook page. So please be sure to check out the lineup. And please don't forget to fill out the survey and let us know what you thought about our program today. Thanks again, and have a good night, everyone.